Welcome to Channel's Business Global with me, Juliana Olayinka, from our studios here in London. Over the next half an hour, we'll be looking beyond the business headlines by giving you in-depth perspective on the stories that are affecting all of us. Today's show is a special Channel's Business Global, where we'll be looking back at some of the major stories we have covered during the first half of 2021. From the historic inauguration of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris at the beginning of the year, to the complex and confusion surrounding the relaxation of restrictions across the world. Channel's Business Global has been there to share the details behind the headlines. As always, we'll start the show with the biggest British news stories. On Monday, Britain's Prime Minister Boris Johnson announced that the country would be going into a third national lockdown to try to slow a surge in COVID-19 cases that threatens to overwhelm parts of England's national health system. The new restrictions include school closures and rules requiring most people to stay at home, apart from essential shopping, exercise and other limited exceptions.
As I speak to you tonight, our hospitals are under more pressure from COVID than at any time since the start of the pandemic. In England alone, the number of COVID patients in hospitals has increased by nearly a third in the last week to almost 27,000. And that number is 40% higher than the first peak in April.
Well, in order to help support businesses through a difficult period through to the spring, today we've announced £4.6 billion of additional help. For businesses in the most affected sectors who are asked to close, they will receive up to £9,000 in a one-off cash grant. It's important to remember that comes on top of the existing monthly grants of £3,000 that those businesses receive and the extension of furlough all the way through to April. We remain committed to protecting jobs and supporting businesses.
For a lot of businesses who were on the brink before, they were hoping, the UK economy was going to open back up. But obviously, as we've seen cases rise, it's come to this. And I think a lot of businesses within hospitality and leisure and retail are really going to struggle now, because obviously everything was online before, but now it's even more important. And for those businesses that can't operate solely online, which is many of them, it's going to be really hard, especially as the most optimistic of the people out there, Boris Johnson, said maybe mid-February will begin to open back up. Well, that's over a month away, and also he is very optimistic, so it's more likely to be more like sort of March and the spring.
The EU says it has begun legal action against the UK over breaches related to the Northern Ireland Protocol. Brussels is outraged over Downing Street's recent move to postpone British exporters to Northern Ireland having to provide export certificates. Firms exporting across the Irish Sea from the British mainland were initially given a 3-month grace period to avoid the extra bureaucracy, but some supermarkets in Northern Ireland were hit by shortages. The UK unilaterally decided to extend this grace period, which covers areas such as animal products and parcel deliveries, until October.
The government has quietly decided that they're going to extend this period of grace without telling the EU. And about a week ago, the EU wrote to the UK government saying, what's going on here? What do you intend to do about this? Because we might have to take you to court. And the UK government said they would respond in due course. They haven't responded, and the European Commission is now saying that, this might end up in the European Court of Justice, which is not a great place to be for the UK government. It is interesting, though, about what could happen there, because obviously we're not in Europe anymore. So it's not like the EU can say we're going to kick you out of Europe, because we're already out of Europe. So how realistically they can deal with this, it's a lot of people are asking that question. Would it be a fine? Would it be? But I guess the fact that we're in this position isn't something that the government or Downing Street wants to shout about. It's the second time in so many months that the UK government have been accused of breaking international law. So they're saying that this is going to be a short-term thing, and this is just to deal with a couple of logistical difficulties with Brexit, I guess.
The investigation into who released CCTV video of the now disgraced former health chief, Matt Hancock, kissing his aide is ongoing, and according to security sources will be the easiest leak inquiry in history. Prime Minister Boris Johnson is facing increasing scrutiny over his handling of the affair, with critics questioning how Hancock managed to survive serious allegations of unlawful behaviour, cronyism, lying, ineptitude and fatal mistakes in the handling of the pandemic.
He's quite established within the Conservative Party. Obviously, he was the Chancellor before he had that falling out with Dominic Cummings and the Prime Minister around a year ago and resigned, and then Rishi Sunak was brought in. So I think he's, from a perspective of kind of steadying the ship in terms of that department, he's done quite a good job already just being him and going in there. He's also said things that are quite popular, I think, with the party and with the country. He said that, we're going to have to learn to live with COVID-19. He says he doesn't see any reason why we can't reopen fully on the 19th of July. And he says that despite cases rising, the number of deaths are still pretty low. So I think that's kind of what people want to hear. They want to have some positive news after a long time of mainly negative news.
Aside from the ongoing fallout of COVID-19, the biggest story of the year belonged to Washington. Allow me to cast your mind back to January.
Please raise your right hand and repeat after me. I, Joseph Robinette Biden Jr., do solemnly swear.
I, Joseph Robinette Biden Jr., do solemnly swear.
That I will faithfully execute.
That I will faithfully execute.
The office of President of the United States.
Office of President of the United States.
And will, to the best of my ability.
Will, to the best of my ability.
Preserve, protect, and defend.
Preserve, protect, and defend.
The Constitution of the United States.
The Constitution of the United States.
So help you God.
So help me God.
Congratulations, Mr. President.
Well, yesterday was monumental, like you said, for so many reasons. And the feeling on the ground was various in emotions. There was relief, for one thing, that nothing happened. And there was also a sense of a welcoming of normal leadership. The norms were restored. And even though there were a lot of people that wished for a different president, the majority of people just want to look forward. And so, and I'm in a red state, like you said, the majority here, especially in the rural areas where I practice, most of them wanted a different president. But the people that wanted to overturn the wish of the people, those are not the majority. The enormity of what happened on January the 6th has kind of overshadowed that. The current sense is they can do both. They are being called upon to multitask, and even the Congress and the Senate, most of them are agreed on the fact that they can do both. Like Senator put it, most Americans juggle many things in one day, so they can multitask. And some put it more funnily, that they can walk and chew gum at the same time.
Many in the Republican Party were appalled by the incitement of insurrection at the Capitol Hill on January the 6th, yet a handful of them did stand by the former president until the bitter end. Some say it was a relationship of fear over admiration. However, there's no denying that Trump's legacy will haunt the party for years to come.
It was a political disaster, more so for President Trump than the party in general, in terms of the riots and the mob activity at the Capitol. But for the party, the Georgia special election, or the Georgia Senate runoff election, was a complete disaster. It was a race that the Republicans easily could have won, and the polls were indicating that in early December. But partly because of the president essentially ignoring the race, that was a race that they could have won and they lost. And that was truly a disaster for the party, and more importantly, a disaster for the country. There's a few moving parts here. One is that, the mob violence was universally condemned by the party and by all Americans. So that, I think it's pretty easy to segregate that very small group. Even President Biden, I thought, had a great comment on that evening, that this was a small mob of extremists, and it doesn't reflect America, nor does it reflect Republicans in general. So if you could just segregate that very small extreme group from the rest of the party, that's easy. I think that's a disservice to President Biden, who, and in many ways, from a purely partisan perspective, what they've done in the last 2 weeks has actually helped Trump, or helped his reputation, believe it or not, by being really outrageous and vindictive in terms of how they're treating not President Trump, but how they're treating Trump voters and Trump supporters. Remember, 74 million people did vote for him. So I think it's an opportunity for Biden to show some leadership, because one of the concerns going into the election was that Biden would be pressured or pushed around by the progressive left-wing of the party. So far, it looks like he's basically serving them more than he's serving his own interests as more of a centrist. So I hope that he pushes back a little bit. So far, I'm not seeing that. He hasn't really pushed back against impeachment. That's not really indicating that he's going to control the party from the center. And then some of his executive actions already, for example, shutting down the Keystone Pipeline, that doesn't connect with voters. This is economic destruction. And that's what I think many voters, especially Republicans, are afraid of, given, the real economic gains that were made over the last 4 years by everybody in America, including minority groups that typically vote Democrat. And that's why, the president and Republicans did very well with different ethnic groups and minority groups in the country. So I hope that he takes advantage of that and maintains some of this, economic expansion. But so far, what I'm seeing is a real tilt to the far left of the party, and that's just going to leave economic destruction.
Is brand America dead? It was almost dying before Trump. Is it over, and can it be resurrected?
We will see. It's definitely dying. It's on its deathbed. I mean, what America needs is a Ronald Reagan type personality. Somebody who can bring the country together, somebody who can lay out a vision, somebody who can articulate the case for why America is still potentially a shining city on a hill and a model for the rest of the world. Our election system to a large extent is broken. They need, why not apply 21st century technology to elections? Let's use, the blockchain or something to have secure, instant, quick elections that people can use their computers to do. America can still recover, but it's going to be very difficult because the fundamental spirit of this country, and I think that was reflected in Donald Trump's presidency, the fundamental spirit of the people in this country is broken. They've lost what it means to be America. They've lost that spirit of liberty, that spirit of freedom. That's, I think since the financial crisis, we don't believe in our markets anymore. We don't believe in capitalism anymore. America is, as an ideal, this idea of a capitalist country that is focused on individualism, not on tribalism, that is focused on progress, on success, on growth, on everybody rising through their own effort. And over the last 50, 60 years, that has been eroding, I think, partially as the welfare state has grown, as the role of government has become bigger and bigger and bigger. And America has become, politically and economically more like Europe than like America used to be. And until it recaptures that spirit, I don't see anybody on the political horizon right now who is capable of recapturing that spirit. But until it does, yes, brand America, what does it mean anymore? Is it different than France or the UK or any other kind of Western European country in its policies, in its economics, and in its politics? It seems as broken as Europe right now. I mean, Europe is not in no great shape either. So we're looking around the world, and what is the model for Nigeria to look up to? What is a model for some of these African countries to look to as where they would like to move forward towards? For much of the developing world, it used to be the United States of America. It's sad if that is going to go away.
Biden is certainly no fan of Boris Johnson, and he's made it very clear some time ago that he sees Boris Johnson as a mini Trump. So given the domestic agenda that Joe Biden has on his hands, not least rolling out a vaccine in the United States, not least trying to prepare and return the American economy to what it was pre-COVID. There's lots of infrastructure investment required for roads and bridges and hospitals. There's healthcare reform and widening the net to include more Americans. There's the DACA legislation to protect those that arrived in the United States as children, have grown up there and are yet to become citizens. So, Joe Biden's domestic agenda is pretty packed. And for him to necessarily want to put priority on a deal with the UK, I'm not so sure that's going to happen. Frankly, I think the deal is more likely to be done first with the EU on trade. It's a bigger trading bloc. It's 477 million people. It's a much larger economy and a much larger prize, if you think about it, for US companies than the UK might be. So I'm not very hopeful about Biden wanting to sew this up in the very near future.
What a whirlwind that was. Coming up on Channel's Business Global, we'll be flashing back to some company news that managed to overshadow the COVID pandemic. See you after the break. Welcome back to Channel's Business Global with me, Juliana Olayinka, from our studios here in London. Today's show is a special Channel's Business Global, where we're looking back at some of the major stories we have covered during the first half of 2021. Here are some company news stories that sparked our attention. Twitter stock fell as much as 12% on Monday after the social media company permanently suspended President Donald Trump's account on Friday evening. The share price decline wiped $5 billion from Twitter's market capitalization. The social media giant's bosses suspended Trump's account, which had about 88 million followers, after the world leader's fanning of conspiracy theories about voter fraud and election theft spurred thousands of his supporters to lay siege to the Capitol last week. Spotify has announced an expansion to over 80 new locations across the world, including Nigeria, Pakistan and the Maldives. The vast expansion means that the streaming giant will be active in more than 173 markets. The news comes almost a year after rival firm Apple Music announced its expansion into 52 global markets, taking its total reach to 167. Spotify will introduce 36 languages and tailored local content. The boss of Qantas Airlines has said that the Australian government is going to insist on vaccines for international travellers, and the policy would be legislated as a condition of entry. Australia has closed its borders to almost all foreigners over the past year. Alan Joyce, the chief executive of the national flag carrier, said he thinks passengers would be willing to accept the change. In the second half of 2020, Qantas lost £580 million. That compares with a profit of £430 million in the same period last year. Last month, Qantas pushed back the date at which it expects its international flights to resume from July to the end of October. India's domestic stock market tumbled at the start of the week as the country's COVID situation has become critical. This fresh wave of the pandemic has hit the world's second most populous country with a deadlier force than the first, and active cases have shot up at an alarming rate. Earlier in the week, officials reported 314,835 new coronavirus cases, the highest one-day tally recorded anywhere in the world. Deaths rose by 2,104 in the same period, the country's highest death toll. Investors are worried about the pace of India's economic recovery as the expansion of coronavirus curves has impacted business activity across several sectors. Both the Nifty 50 and the BSE Sensex dropped more than 2% at the close of Monday's trading. Transport for London has secured another short-term funding agreement worth £1.08 billion from the British government to keep the capital's public transport services running. The current deal comes on top of the £1.6 billion it received in May 2020, £1.8 billion in November, and a £500 million support package received in March. London Mayor Sadiq Khan and transport union bosses have slammed the deal as it comes with several conditions, which include a wage freeze, pension reforms, rising fares, as well as other cost-cutting measures. The success of Africa's tech startups has become crucial in the drive to turn around the losses induced by the COVID-19 pandemic. We've spoken to several experts in the field over the year, reporting a positive outlook for the continent's economic future.
Last year, quite frankly, it was a year of uncertainty, not just in Africa, but across emerging markets in general. But what was fantastic about what startups did last year was they started to innovate. And we started to see investments that ordinarily we haven't seen outside of COVID. And one that I will mention is the acquisition of Paystack by Stripe, which was at the height of the pandemic. So that was very encouraging. And I think that signaled to a lot of international investors that Africa is still open, the startups are still innovating, that we're still developing homegrown solutions to the myriad of complex challenges that are occurring on the continent. So I think in spite of the year generally being slow, I mean, you can see from our report that African startups were able to raise 1.1 billion in 2020. And I mean, yes, that's been a little bit of a dip from the year before by 400 million. But when you contextualize it amidst all of the economic recession that was happening because of COVID, you can see there was quite a successful year for the startups. So I think what that signaled was we were still innovating. Businesses were still coming out and they were still able to raise funding, which is very important. And finally, the most important thing is the international and domestic investment community still backed startups in Africa and still believed in the potential of the startup businesses on the continent. Africa, as we know, it's the most fantastic continent, and I rarely like to refer to it as just saying Africa, because we know it's made up of 54 very diverse countries. But I think what investors have started seeing is you can't necessarily just take a product that you've seen in Global North and just place it in Global South. It needs to be developed bottom up. We as Africans or people on the ground, we understand the complexities and the challenges that are being faced on the continent. So that's why homegrown solutions are really important. And that's why we've seen them be successful. For instance, we mentioned in our report, the Heat Riding app. It's becoming fantastic on the continent. You know, the likes of Uber, they have gone in and they've done quite well, but there's still room for us to develop our own homegrown solutions. And we're seeing that not just in logistics, we're seeing that in fintech, a lot in fintech actually, but we're seeing that in the healthcare sector as well. So to your point about how investors have learned that it's better to just back some of the existing players on the continent, I think it's just, like I said earlier, it's just a testament to the quality of businesses that are coming out.
Of course, the infrastructure deficit in the healthcare sector in Nigeria is massive, right? And, you know, we raised about 2.3 million. And so that's not going to fix all the problems in the healthcare sector in Nigeria. But what we can show is that we can build healthcare infrastructure in a very efficient way and in a very sustainable way, and also in a way that it can scale. So, and as we grow, as we raise this money to keep building infrastructure and keep proving that our model works, we think that we would actually get more funding to be able to even scale that even more to more places. We think that having virtual care or digital care, as you might call it, really helped a lot. If you remember last year, a lot of things were locked down. And so people weren't able to go to the hospital like they used to go to the hospital, right? And having this access to like a virtual way to access their doctor was quite important. And also as the isolation centers started getting filled up, and I think that that's the promise of digital healthcare, where you can, sit at home and get some of you need, and you can even have a doctor come home to you. So for us at MDAS, one of the things that we did last year was we did a lot of COVID screenings. We ran some sample collection sites, and we were testing people for just both COVID and a lot of the underlying conditions for COVID. And what we realized was that the COVID situation in Nigeria was actually better than most countries. The caseload was definitely better. But what we saw was that a lot of people had underlying conditions, undiagnosed hypertension, diabetes, that they didn't know. And this was a problem area. So what we did was actually created another product called Sentinel X to tackle that particular problem, where we get people access to personalized preventive care. They can come in, screen themselves, and then we give them access to a doctor year round. And this happens via digital tech, via your cell phone, via an app. So
COVID-19, I mean, as you know, across several businesses, it's really forced the agenda for digitization, for remote work, for remote interviews like what we're having now. I think this has really become the norm. So on one end, I think if you think about it, right, a lot of the tools that we're using pretty much were existent a long time ago. Zoom in itself has existed for over 10 years. We've always had Google Hangouts. Skype has been present. And what it did was it forced us to recognize that we could do things in another way, right? Because typically the world had been designed around probably about 150 years of a working culture driven from industrialization. And basically we're now moving to a very fast stage of digitization. So I think if you look at that overall and you apply that to so we're not seeing anything that I think is strange or negative. I think it's actually positive because it's made people much more effective. We have a much more better way of handling our operational cost as well. I think in the automotive sector, what is basically also driven is the importance of digitization in the automotive sector. So particularly for AutoCheck, we are focused on digital approvals and applications of loans by consumers. We're trying to drive accessibility and affordability for customers. So it works 100% in our favor because we're finding banks able to scale up their auto lending portfolios, dealerships can build their businesses, consumers can access loans, all from all remotely. And that's basically why our technology is doing so well, and we've seen such a great reception from the market. So I think in general, this is just the beginning of the wave in terms of digitization, but I think it's all positive. And there's so many benefits that are going to come out from this, especially with technology companies.
Well, sadly, that's all we have time for on today's special Channels Business Global, but do get in touch with your comments and suggestions. I'll see you at the same time next week, where I'll be back with all the latest in-depth business analysis on Channels Business Global. Goodbye.